I didn't get that many. I got 14 gallons. Well, considering I had 300 taps out, that wasn't a very good run. 300. No, 300 taps. Well, it depends upon the size of the tree, you know. Yeah, depending upon their size. I am ready. Well, here we are at another session of accurately handling the word of truth. Study and a commentary on 1 Corinthians 12 through 14. We're addressing and taking a look at 1 Corinthians 14, 33, and 34. Before I launch into 33, I want to say one more thing about the previous verse, where it talks about the spirit of the prophets, subject to the prophets, and he's been talking about prophecy for the last 4 verses there, and giving additional information. But I wanted to say one thing that most people don't realize about prophecy and interpretation of tongues is that with both prophecy and interpretation of tongues, those two have to run a formidable obstacle course to get from God's mind what God wants to say to the congregation all the way through just a real tough course to get to the minds of the hearers. It's got to go through, and let me just kind of go through that with you here so that you can kind of see on the first page there is that it's an obstacle course that begins, first of all, number one, it's God's thoughts must be brought to the imperfect mind, will, and perceptions and memory, and even into the biases and imaginations of a person. God has to take his amazing thoughts. His thoughts are so much higher than ours, and he's got to get them into our mind, into our imagination, and you know what our minds and imaginations and biases are like. Well, he's got to do that, and that's only the first step. He's got to get that into one person's mind. The second thing, of course, is the biggest, is that at that point they have to decide whether they're going to do anything about it. And everything could stop right there. It's kind of like those little turtles that hatch up on the beach, and they got to make their way all the way down from where their nest was all the way down to the water. And in between, there's obstacles, and there's predators, and there's heat and cold and all kinds of things. And there are very few of those little turtles that make it down to the water, into the safety of the water. And even in the water, they've got problems and predators and things down there. And that's the way it is with God's thought. He's giving to man millions and millions and millions of his thoughts. He's imparting his thoughts to people's, like I say, their minds, but also their perceptions, their attitudes, their memories, everything. And a lot of times it gets all messed up right at the beginning. Well, then if he gets a person that's willing to do something about this thought that they've had and go, I think that was from God. I think God wants me to know something there. Then number 2 is God's thoughts must be processed by that imperfect brain to be converted into words. Now, this is of the small minority of Christians that would even give this a try. See? It's got to be converted from God's perfect thoughts through an imperfect brain. Okay, most of us had a lot of trouble even getting human thoughts into our brain, and then we've got God's thoughts having to be converted and come out as words. Now, the words must be verbalized through physical organs that make it possible to speak. So you've got to take this concept and this idea that you've processed through this imperfect brain, and you've got to bring it out through your voice. You've got to actually say something. To many people, it is actually painful for them to consider the idea of addressing with words a group of people. It's a fearful thing for them to just actually imagine the thing of opening their mouths and pushing air through their vocal cords and making the noise, making speech. The speech then of the prophecy speaker must be then, if the speaker finally gets the word out, then it has to be comprehended by imperfect minds that are hearing it. The wills, the perceptions, memories, bias, and imaginations of all those people that are hearing it. Whether it be a small group or a large group, whether it be recorded or whether it be in person, it's got to impact an imperfect mind. Okay. And then that has to get from the mind of the person, because they've got to hear it and it's got to go through their brain. And then guess what? It's got to make an incredibly long journey of about, what do they say? It's about 14 inches from your brain to that midriff part of you where your spirit is, so that or what's many times called our heart, and if at any time along the way this whole process breaks down, then it becomes less and less of God's pure word and more of man's manufacture. Therefore, that's why we end up with a mixture that has to be judged. See? This is the reason, because it's such an obstacle course and there's so many places where things can go wrong, that the New Testament says, sort it out. Because it's got a lot of opportunities to get messed up along the way. So when they say, everybody prophesy, let's just go ahead and start prophesying, let's do that, they're not realizing everything that goes into that a lot of times. This should make you flee to the Lord and say, if this is ever going to happen, you're going to have to help me. If I'm ever going to be someone that can produce the Word of God for the edification of the church, you're going to have to help me, because this has got too many places where it can go wrong. And that's the whole thing, is that the message is subject to the prophets. All of these, the message has to go through this whole labyrinth and obstacle course of the prophets before he says anything. Anyway, let's go on here. God has taken a great risk by entrusting his thoughts to fallible and selfish human beings. Why does he even bother? It's all because he loves. And he takes a risk. He takes his precious and pure word and then gives it to imperfect human beings who may not say what he wants the church to hear. So he has things he wants the church to hear. He wants to edify, he wants to encourage, exhort, and the prophet may not do it, or may do it in such a mixture that it's hard to sort out the difference between their own thoughts and will and personalities and God's word along the way. So the risk is great for God, but yet he thinks it's worth it. To communicate with these thick-headed human beings with these imperfect minds and wills, he thinks it's worth it. He's done everything that could possibly be done in order for that to happen. But it says, as Paul puts it, guess where he's put that treasure? That treasure of his pure word that edifies, that refreshes, that motivates, that enlightens us. He puts it in an earthen vessel. He puts it in a cracked pot. And that's what pleased him to do it. All right, so that's enough on that. Let's go on to verse 33. For God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. The first word there is for. We think that for is just a King James way of filling dead space. But for simply means because. Because God is not the author of confusion. Because why? Because what? You got to look at what came before. All these instructions about how to prophesy are for one reason only. Is because God is not the author of confusion. When we prophesy, and it's got to go through this imperfect obstacle course and break down in so many different ways and be a mixture and get fouled up, we need to realize that these limitations and requirements that have been put on prophets, put on prophecy speakers, is because God is not the author of confusion. Now notice that he does not say, as he said 4 other places, he does not say you should do all these things because it will edify the church. In 4 other places, he said, you should do all these things because it will edify the church. And this one place in verse 33, he doesn't say that. He says, you should do all these things because it doesn't represent God well if it's confused. You're not showing who God is. You're not showing what he's like if your prophecies are all confused. If they're a mixture. If they're all the things I said before, that obstacle course going through there. He's saying the reason why I'm making all these rules on you is not to burden you down with a bunch of rules. It's because God is not going to be represented in the church, by the church, if prophecy and speaking in tongues and interpretation of tongues is confused, if it's leaving people confused, if it's leaving them scratching their heads and wondering what's going on here, that does not represent God. And the churches, if nothing else, the church does one thing on this earth, and that represents what God is like. Wow, do we need to fall on our faces and say, Lord, I need your help, because I can't prophesy in a way that represents you well because of all the imperfections, limitations, and selfishness in me. I need your help in order to do this right, and I need your help if the church is going to be a representative of God. So The reason is, why? Because God. He's the reason why we prophesy and speak in tongues and interpret it. All right. Look at this next phrase here in that verse. God is not the author of confusion. If you'll notice on your study guide there that I crossed out the words the author. Because guess what? They are not in the original manuscripts, in the most reliable Greek texts that we have. Those two words are not in there. They were just thrown in there. I can't explain why. They were just thrown in there. What's left over, if you ignore what you must ignore, the words the author, you got to take them out of there. What you end up with is God is not of confusion. And confusion, of course, is disturbance and instability. Those are the things that we must not. If we're going to be the church that represents God in the world, we must not be ministering disturbance or instability, because it doesn't tell the world who God is. God is not of those things. Paul is comparing the traits and qualities of the pagan gods to the traits and qualities of the one true God. Because remember, we just got through with this thing, is that the spirits or the spiritual gifts of the prophets, the gift of prophecy is subject to the prophets. That means they're in total control of it. And that's the other reason is he's saying that God is not of confusion, is because the gods of the pagans, their biggest characteristic was confusion and disturbance. If you know anything about Greek religion, about Greek pagan religion and Roman pagan religion and their gods and the way they worshiped those gods and the way they lived out their lives before these gods, you'll find out that the pagan gods were characterized by, and this is a big word, but it does kind of say what the gods, they're capricious. It means there's sudden, unpredictable change without motive or for no reason at all. And if you know anything about the activities of the pagan gods, you find out that they're incredibly unpredictable, with no possible reason or motive for their changes. And Paul is saying, compared to the gods that you have worshipped for thousands of years, and it's down in your bone that gods are of that God is of confusion, that God authors confusion, that he's a source of it. You'll find that many of the gods were the sources of confusion. And the very reason, the chaotic and unstable natures of the gods were the very reason why they were worshipped. Because you got to remember that the people in first century Mediterranean areas where these pagan gods were active and influencing, these evil spirits were dominating the lives of people, is that there was two things that caused their lives to be absolutely suffocating. One was the patronage system, or the patriarchal system that they all lived under, which meant that everybody was subject to a few elite men. Especially women, of course, but even men of lesser status, they were all under the boot heel of a few elite, powerful men. And that was the biggest stranglehold on the people. They lived lives of grinding drudgery, of obligations and duties and promises they had to keep, fear of retribution, fear of being shamed by somebody superior to them, all kinds of things that they were really in fear of. This really caused them all to conform and stay in line. And then, of course, the other thing about the Mediterranean area where these gods were loved and worshipped and they were so enthusiastic about them is it was the Roman law. The Roman law just constricted everybody down and ground everybody down like a pencil sharpener. To one size fits all. And so between the patriarchal system that was part of the Roman thing, but it was also much bigger than that throughout the world at that time, and Roman law, their lives were grindingly constricted. Guess where they got their only relief? The only safe place that there was for them to throw off the chains of this stuff. If they just simply went about and threw off the chains of the Roman law, what would happen? Death. If they threw off the obligations and commitments and debts that they owed in the patriarchal system, what would happen? Death. So there was one safe place in all of first century Mediterranean area where they could throw off restraint and be free from the obligations. And that was in the worship of these capricious gods. These gods that were wild and unpredictable. They liked it that way. They wanted it that way because it was the get out of jail free card for them. And Paul, he's addressing that whole thing. Why don't we notice it? Because we don't understand the life of the people that he was writing to. Is he saying God is not of confusion? Your gods were of confusion, but God is not. Now, the next thing about this is that if God is not a God that's characterized by confusion, then our logic, our Western logical mind says, if he's not characterized by confusion, then he must be characterized by the opposite trait of confusion, which is, what? No, it's not. Our idea is that if it's the opposite of confusion, it's order. It's order. It's not peace. And then Paul, he throws a curve at them because he doesn't say what we expect. He doesn't say what we expect. He says, God is not a confusion. He's a God of order. See, now he uses the word order later on, but not here. Because we have this idea that the opposite of confusion is order, like military order. Everybody line up. And in fact, that's what happens, is that we have church order. Don't have a whole lot of church peace, but we do have a lot of church order where everything lines up and we do things the same every time, and nobody should question or get an original or creative idea that steps out of the line that we're in together. Okay? And that's the problem, is that order produces silence and passivity amongst everybody except for a few elite men. So what we end up doing is that we end up back in our own Christianized patriarch system. where there's a few elite, powerful men that keep everybody else in line. That is not our God. That is not what God represents, and that is not a good representation of what God is like, because it says the next thing. One guy said this, that it was the best, is that you can tell, it says, the character of one's deity is reflected in the character of one's worship. In other words, what he's saying is that you can tell what you think of your deity by how you worship him. And that's a pretty telling statement there a lot of times, when in our Western culture, and possibly in many other places too, where it's very passive, it's very silent, it's very hierarchical, down like this. Is that the kind of God we represent? Is that God? Paul says that's not God. That's not who we're about. But neither are we about this confused, capricious throwing off restraint either. He says, then he goes in to say, but of peace. Peace is the healthy and normal state of one who is aligned with the will of God. All right? The will of God in connection with speaking in tongues, interpretation of tongues, and prophesying is best summarized by verse 25. If you went back to what we talked about in verse 25, you will notice there that what Paul gives a scenario of what he considers to be speaking in tongues, interpretation of tongues, and prophecy aligned with the will of God. And what does he say in there? He says, what's the result of a God of peace being represented in the church with those three grace gifts? It says he will worship God. He will report that God is in you of a truth. That is what it's like to be aligned with the will of God. That's what peace is like. Peace is not passive. Peace is not silent. You can find out if you read the whole verse 24 and 25 that we just got through studying a few weeks ago. You'll find out that there was lots of activity. There was lots of talking. There was lots of interaction by a whole bunch of different people in the body of Christ. It says that every one of you would have something. And he says, as a result of that kind of peace, because this is the will of God in Christ concerning you, when you have that, guess what happens? People get saved. People worship God and report that God is in you of a truth. That's the result. And then the other thing is that peace is defined as harmonious relationships. The presence of God in an assembly is brought about through harmonious relationships. God knows that we have all been really, really tested on being a church of peace with harmonious relationships. We are, God knows we're being exercised. We're being exercised to represent the God of peace in harmonious relationships. Outsiders and skeptics can see the character of the one true God as they observe the activities and words that are deliberately intended to love the others. And when they do see that, they start to worship God, and then they report to their neighbors and to the people that sent them. God is there. God is in their midst. John 14:35. Men will realize that you are disciples of the one true God because you love one another. Herein shall all men know that you are my disciples, that you love one another. So there is the thing. As in all the churches of the saints. Now, this has been a phrase that has been debated and discussed. It's the fourth time that he refers to what goes on in other churches that he has contact with. You can see the other places where he does that too. There's been an attempt to make verse 34 and 35 connected with as in all the churches of the saints. Now, when we get to 34 and 35, we find out that it's full of prohibitions. Full of prohibitions. Okay? And they say that there's a whole bunch of prohibitions in all the churches of the saints. They connect this last phrase with the next verses. But it's far more likely and reasonable that that when he says in all the churches of the saints, he's talking about the peace. He's talking about the God of peace is in all the churches. That's the characteristic of all the churches of the saints, is a God of peace. And that the people see that and they worship God and they report that God is in your midst. So this phrase here, I don't think that it's a good attempt to say that all the churches of all the churches of the saints prohibit women from speaking, which is what's coming up in the next verses. Got more of that, but I just want to point this out, is that this has been misused and said that it talks about what's coming, but I think that it's talking about what has been already said. All right. God help us. Here we go. Now we're at 34. Man, you look at 34, you're tracking with Paul for the last, from verse 27 on to verse 33, he's been talking about how to do speaking in tongues and interpretation. And he's been also talking about how to do prophecy. And then out of the clear blue sky, you come up with this. Let your women keep silent in the churches. This is kind of like from out in left field. I mean, you think you've finally figured out what Paul is talking about. Oh, yeah, we're getting instructions about prophecy, and we're getting instructions about speaking in tongues, and who comes first, and what needs to, there needs to be this, and there needs to be that. And all of a sudden, he throws this great big rock into the middle of the road. Let your women keep silent in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. Whoo, man alive. What happened to Paul? What they kidnapped Paul and they put in a clone or something like that? Maybe we got a clone with horns, or what in the world is going on here all of a sudden? It is not surprising that there are very good people that believe that this is another one of those quotations that Paul did where he was quoting somebody else. It wasn't Paul speaking here at all. Okay? And I don't blame him. I think there's a better explanation. It's a tricky one, but I think that I'm not going to simply dismiss this verse and say it's so out to lunch. It's got to be him quoting some wacko that wrote to him. I think that he actually said these things. But boy, is it going to take some unpacking. In order to understand this verse, we must go all the way back to verse 29. And verse 29, as you see in your study guide there, simply says, let the prophets speak 2 or 3, and let the others judge. Okay, if you don't see the connection yet, it's all right. Hang in there with me. In that verse, Paul gave 2 commands. Do you see that there's 2 commands in one sentence? Only Paul can put 2 heavy-duty, heavyweight commands in one sentence. Number 1, let the prophets speak 2 or 3. Number 2 is an entirely different command. Let the others judge. Now, I put a color coding in here. I want to see if I can help you understand that verse 29 is Paul commanding the churches. He's saying, this you must do. And then for the next, 30 through 35, he gives additional instructions about how to do those 2 commands. Okay, look at verse 29 in the color-coded blue. Are you all on the page where it's color-coded in blue and red? I put down that the first command that Paul gives is in blue. Let the prophets speak 2 or 3. Okay? The second command I put in red to make you see that there's a difference between these 2, and that for verse 30, 31, 32, 33, and for those 30 through 33, I put those instructions in blue because what are all those instructions? They're additional instructions about how to let the prophets speak. Look at verse 30. If anything be revealed to another that sitteth by, let the first hold his peace. That's instructions about prophets speaking. Look at verse 31. For you may all prophesy one by one, that all may learn and all may be comforted. What is he giving information about? About letting prophets speak. Letting them speak. Verse 32, I hope you're following me on this. And the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. What's that information about? What's that directions about? About letting prophets speak. And verse 33, for God is not an author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. What is that a principle of? Letting prophets speak. He's talking about, because I'm giving you these instructions because God is not going to minister confusion. He's going to minister peace and harmonious relationships. And those are all instructions that Paul gives about the first command in verse 29. Let the prophets speak 2 or 3. In verse 34, however, he's finally done 4 verses of instructions about how to let the prophets speak. When he gets done with all those instructions about let the prophets speak, he immediately starts giving instructions about let the others judge. But what in the world does let your women keep silent in the churches have to do with let the others judge? For it is not permitted unto them to speak. They're commanded to be under obedience, as it also saith the law. What does that have to do with let the others judge? Remember that when prophets speak, then the people that have heard it are to evaluate and thoroughly separate out the mixture of that which is God's thoughts and that which is the prophet's thoughts. Okay? And we just went through that thing of that whole obstacle course that a word from God has to go through. No wonder it's not perfect. No wonder it's a mixture. And that's what it's got to, so when a prophet speaks, the others have to judge. But who would have thought that his instructions about let the others judge would be prohibitions about certain people not being allowed to judge? That's what's going on here, is that he says, let the others judge. However, there are certain people in the church that are not permitted to do it. Take that and chew on that for a second. A couple of reasons why it's hard for us to see the connection between let the others judge and let your women keep silence is because there's such a length of instructions about let the prophet speak before he gets a chance to talk about instructions for let the others judge. And there's just so much information in there that it's hard for us to remember that he's still talking about these commands that he gave. The other reason why it's so hard for us to grasp that let your women keep silence in the churches could have anything to do with let the others judge is because no one of us would have expected that his instructions about let the others judge would actually be prohibitions. Because all the verses about let the prophet speak were about things that you must do. And now his instructions about let the others judge have to do with you must not do. Now, that's one of the objections that some scholars have come with and say it's so complicated that even the Corinthians couldn't understand what was going on there. I think that they could. I think they could. And to just simply write this whole thing off and say, it's just a quote, it's just a legalistic quote from somebody else, I don't think so. I think that Paul was saying that when the others judge, you must watch out that not everybody gets a chance to weigh in on certain prophecies. You got to watch out for that. Now, I'm going to unpack that the best I can. I got 15 minutes to take a look at this. Okay, I just finished talking about this in the first 4 verses. He gives the additional instructions about let the prophet speak 2 or 3. Immediately after he gets through with those instructions about prophecy, he immediately gives 2 verses of additional instructions about let the others judge. The great length is a problem. It makes it difficult for us to see that there's a connection between those two. And nobody expected that Paul's additional instructions would come as a prohibition. That takes us by surprise, takes me by surprise. The connection between let the others judge up in verse 29, and let your women keep silence in verse 34, must not be lost. Must not be lost. You got to hold on to that. Otherwise, it will appear that Paul is suddenly interjecting a random prohibition on all women for all time and in all churches. And that's what most of the church believes, that Paul just threw this great big massive boulder in the midst of his discussion about the spiritual gifts, and he just drops this big rant about women right in the middle of it and prohibits women from speaking in church. Is that what you agree with? Is that the kind of God that we're representing? Capricious? Just like the pagan gods? Random changes of mind at any time? That's pagan. That's not our God. God is not that kind of confusion. But this verse has been accepted as just this confusing rock in the middle of the road, and we're supposed to just accept it. Okay? I want to dig a little deeper. First word in this verse is let. Let. Okay. Not surprising that the word let is not in the Greek text. I should have put a line through let, but I didn't. It's not in the Greek text. You must ignore the word let. It's not in there. It's another one of those things that was added by translators. I don't know why they do these things, but they did. Why is that important to ignore that word? Because let implies that someone has the power to give or withhold permission. I will let you be silent. Someone is giving permission to women to keep silent. That's what let implies. Yes. Second word in there, let your. Your implies that someone owns the women. Let your women, it says in that verse there. And I just cringe at this one here because it's just, this implies that someone owns the women. Let your women. Okay? Implies that someone owns the women, and Paul is speaking to the ones that own them. He's addressing somebody who owns the women and saying, let them be silent. Oh, they're begging to be silent. Just let them be silent. No, it's not what this verse is communicating at all. The word your, if you do a little digging like I did, the word your is the word Haman. And it does not mean your, it means you. Again, it's one of those things that if you don't watch out, it'll come and bite you. The word is not your there. The word is you. 203 times the Greek word Haman is translated you. Except in this spot. One time it's translated your. What is up with this? I'm not going to talk about conspiracy theories. Okay. The word there is you, women, not your women. It's you, women. Paul is not speaking to somebody who owns women. He's talking to the women themselves. You women. He just turns from instruction and being a teacher, and he turns to the women, and he addresses the women in Corinth right face to face. You women. These little rail switches are subtle, but they're powerful. Without understanding this, you get the idea that Paul is a misogynist that believes that men should own women and that they're just simply cattle. Paul is speaking to the women themselves. Now, here's the next thing you need to know about it is that many of the ancient Greek manuscripts do not have the word Haman, whether it's be translated as you or yours at all. Don't even have the word Haman in them. What they have instead is the Greek word I. And I just simply means the in Greek. So many manuscripts, the verse 34 starts out either you women or the women. None of them say your women except this spot. I think that we got an example here of 16th century male-dominated society where the translators that were translating this from Latin for King James's sake realized that King James was a misogynist, and they knew which side their bread was buttered on, and they knew they wouldn't get paid and their monastery wouldn't get supported if they didn't stroke King James, because this Bible was authorized by him, and he, by God, better like it. My opinion. The women is Paul's subject. Has nothing to do with people who dominate, own, give permission to, withhold permission from women at all. He's just talking about the women, or he's talking directly to the women. Okay, the next word that needs a good scrubbing is the word women. The word women in Greek is gune. Okay? Now, and gune simply means woman, or plural, guneske is women, plural. It also, here, get this, you wouldn't know this from your education, that gune also means wife in 2/3 of the places where gune is written in the scriptures. Gune does not mean woman, does not mean women. It means wife or wives. So how can you tell? It's gune here, it's gune there, gune everywhere. Is it women or is it wife? Is it, what is it? You got to look at the surrounding context. See, you got to look at what came before it and what comes after it to see if you can get clues as to whether this means women or wives. And lo and behold, if you look in verse 35, the next verse that's absolutely connected, remember the verse divisions are man-made. They're not God. Paul didn't put verse divisions in. in the next sentence is what I should say. In the very next sentence, guess what we have? And we'll get to it. We'll get to it sometime. That he says, lo and behold, these gunes, these women, should ask who? Their husbands at home. So if you're talking about gunes, women that have husbands they can ask at home, those women are wives. So the contextual clue here is that when he says, you women, what he's saying there is not women, he's saying, you wives. You wives. So now we're getting someplace. We haven't gotten there all the way yet, but we're getting there, is that this verse, along with so many other places, is really a train wreck in the English translations we have. But what he's really saying is he's turned to the wives in the congregation, and he's addressing them, and he's saying, you wives need to keep silence. That's what the next part of that is, isn't it? There it says, women, keep silence. This one needs a good scrubbing too. Needs a good scrubbing. The word keep silence is one word in Greek, and it's sigaio, and here's what it means. It doesn't mean must not say a word. What sigaio means is a voluntary choice not to tell. In other words, to keep a secret. That's what sigaio means. It does not mean must not say a word in church, which is what most people think Paul was saying. But he's not. He's saying, you wives, there's certain things you must not tell. Secret. Okay. I put down here several places where the word sigaio is used, that others voluntarily choose not to tell. They keep a secret. In Luke 9:36, Peter, James, and John, coming down from the Mount of Olives, they voluntarily, Jesus asked them to, coming down from the Mount of Transfiguration, they said, whoa, we got a story for you. And Jesus said, be sigaio about this. In other words, they voluntarily chose not to tell what they witnessed and experienced on the Mount of Transfiguration. Sigaio. They kept a secret from the other 12. From the other disciples, whatever. I can't do math when I'm up here. Okay, Romans 16:25. Look at this one here. What it says that the glorious gospel of Jesus Christ was kept secret from the beginning, from before the world was created. And who was it kept secret by? God himself. You can look it up. There it is. God voluntarily chose not to tell what he knew. Do you think he's still doing that? Well, in some things, but in that one spot, he's saying rejoice because he let the cat out of the bag on that one there. But God chooses to keep secrets too. Voluntarily. Why? Does he do that for our destruction? No, he does it for our good. Okay? For our good. Luke 20:26. Here's a fun one. Here, the chief priests and scribes, they're testing Jesus. Should we pay taxes or not? Give me a coin. Whose inscription? so give to Caesar what is Caesar's, God what is God. And they huddled together, the chief priests and scribes. This is not the only time they did this too, and said, well, if we say this, people are going to be mad. If we say this, we're breaking the law. And they voluntarily chose not to tell. In other words, it says they held their peace and they decided we're not saying. And that's not the only time. There's other places. What's that? Same word, sagaio. They held their peace is the same word as to keep silent. Let me get through with these verses and then I'll be done with you. Acts 15, 12, 13. The multitude of the disciples were all gathered together to find out what they were going to say about Gentiles being saved. Okay? Cornelius thing. And the multitude, there was a whole lot of these disciples together. And when Barnabas and Paul, it was time for them to speak, guess what? You get all these Jews together. You've heard the saying, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. Okay, so you got a multitude of Jews together about this thing of what Gentiles, can they be saved or not? And what about the Holy Spirit? And they were speaking in tongues and I don't know. And when Paul and Barnabas got up to speak, they all sagaioed. They all held their peace or kept silent or any of those other words that are used to mean they voluntarily chose not to say anymore. Okay? All of these chose to not tell something that they knew. In the same way, going back to verse 34, in the same way, wives are to voluntarily choose not to tell something that they know, and they're to keep it secret. Stay tuned till next time to find out what in the world